When Utah became a state in 1896, it was home to a diverse population of people from all around the world. Many of Utah's people had to work hard to fit in. Some Utahns struggled to prove that they were Americans. Others had to advocate for voting rights. Some had to push for citizenship. What we learn from Utah's past is that many Utahns had to work to overcome the inequalities they faced. Even if a group has American citizenship, this does not mean that their legal, social, or civil rights are protected. It also does not mean that they are accepted by others. Utah's history began over 12,000 years ago when Native Americans first settled in the Great Basin. During the 1700s and 1800s, immigrants from around the world traveled through and settled in Utah. All of these different people meant that Utahns had different cultures, religions, and lifestyles. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often known as Mormons, were some of Utah's first Euro-American settlers. During the late 1800s, they struggled to prove that they could be Americans. Many members of Congress and other leaders believed that Mormons were not true Americans because of some of their religious practices and beliefs. Historian Paul Reeve explains how Mormon religious practices were one factor that prevented Utah from becoming a state for almost 50 years.
The statehood debates made it clear that those in Utah, according to those in Congress, were not American. They weren't true Americans because they were doing things that were deemed un-American. They were engaged in polygamy, and there was an overlap between party politics and religious faith. And as long as Congress looked in on Utah and saw those two things in operation, they continually rejected Utah's applications for statehood. In the estimation of those in Congress, what was going on in Utah violated prevailing understandings of what it means to be an American. They actually argued that polygamy was facilitating race mixing, darkening the white race, making it unfit for democracy. Senator Calhoun in 1848 had argued that democracy is the government of a white race. He argued that people who were not white were racially incapable of participating in democracy. Those in Congress sometimes argued that Latter-day Saints were more like Native Americans than they were like European Americans, or that they were more like African Americans than they were European Americans, that they weren't doing the things that true Anglo-Saxons would do. Therefore, they are racially suspect. So it's not merely a suspect religious group in the minds of those in Congress, but in fact, American democracy is at stake. In the minds of some people in Congress, Latter-day Saint polygamy is not merely destroying the traditional family, it's destroying the white race and making it unfit and incapable of democracy. Political cartoons throughout the 19th century will imagine Latter-day Saint polygamy as facilitating race mixing. They will imagine a white man and a whole string of wives, but their imagination includes an African American wife, and an Asian wife, and a Native American wife. In other words, Latter-day Saints are facilitating race mixing, darkening the white race, making it unfit for democracy. All of those things deemed un-American, and therefore Utah is kept out of the Sisterhood of States, 6 of its 7 applications.
While members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints struggled to be accepted by other Americans, many Utah women joined forces with national suffrage leaders to advocate for the right to vote. In fact, Utah's women gained voting rights twice. Historian Katherine Kitterman explains how women in Utah campaigned for statehood so that they could participate in government and politics at the local and national levels.
Over the years, many anti-polygamy laws were proposed in Congress that would take women's right to vote away as part of other measures to end polygamy. And especially Mormon women had fought those. They had sent petitions back east, they had lobbied political leaders to protect their right to vote. But eventually Congress overruled that objection and passed a law in 1887 that took away all women's right to vote. As statehood was debated in the 1890s in Utah, it really touched on questions of what it means to be an American. And those questions included self-governance, the idea that you should have a voice in your government and be able to have a say in the laws that govern you. So many Utah women were especially interested in this because they saw statehood as a chance to achieve full citizenship. That is, to have the opportunity to vote, to hold public office, to sit on a jury, and other things like this. That was a big deal for Utah women especially, but I think for all Utahns it was important to feel like they had standing as citizens, to be welcomed into that union of states, to show that they were on an equal footing with the rest of the country. And it was also really important to be able to vote for national leaders who affected their lives, such as the president, which they had never been able to vote for. By the time Utah women regained voting rights with Utah statehood, that made them the third state where women had full political equality. And this meant that in 1896, for example, women in only 3 states were able to vote for president. That was Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. So Utah women also saw this as a way to lead out, to show that they could show from their own experience that women's involvement in the political process was a good thing, that they could use their voice to make communities better and stronger when they were involved in those decisions.
Utah's suffragists worked hard to achieve political rights. Their efforts benefited women throughout the country who also pursued the right to vote. In 1896, the state constitution secured women's right to vote in Utah. In fact, most women in Utah voted for more than 20 years before the 19th Amendment extended suffrage to most women. However, statehood did not guarantee voting rights or citizenship to all Utahns. Some communities were excluded by Utah's state constitution. Native Americans struggled for many decades to maintain their sovereignty and to secure political and civil rights. When Utah gained statehood status in 1896, neither the federal or state governments granted Native Americans full citizenship rights. Historian Sondra Jones explains how people in the state of Utah denied Native Americans the right to vote until 1957, 61 years after achieving statehood.
One of the important things to understand about what happened after Utah became a state was that they will write a law that defines the fact that Native Americans were not citizens of the state if they lived on a reservation. In fact, Native Americans were not even Americans. They were not citizens of the United States. They will not be citizens of the United States until 1924, when they passed the Indian Citizenship Act. But in Utah, they carried it even a little bit further, because they denied Native Americans were even, if they were living on a reservation, then they were not living in Utah. They were living on a tribal piece of property with sovereignty, which meant that they were independent. So that made them a citizen of the tribe, not a citizen of the state of Utah. And so Native Americans were not citizens of the state of Utah from 1896 all the way until 1957, when they rewrote that law finally.
Utah's history shows that political rights were not simply given to every Utahn. Many groups and individuals, including Mormons, women, and Native Americans, overcame severe opposition before they gained voting rights and representation. History helps us to learn when and where inequality existed. We can use the knowledge we gain from the Utah experience to understand and overcome similar problems in our communities today.